Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
We're going to be looking at James 4 this morning, in chapters 13 to 14, and in my Bible, which is an NIV Bible, it's subtitled Boasting About Tomorrow. So if you want to turn with me, it says this: "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Now, the downside of being the fourth or fifth person in a series means that, everybody's stolen my sermon up to now. So I apologize if there's a bit of repetition in what you hear today, but sometimes repetition's good. And I want to echo the thoughts of the guys that have preached so far in terms of how much I really like the book of James. I really like that James tells things straight. James doesn't pull any punches, and I like that about him. I think that for me, James is probably one of the most challenging books of the whole Bible, if not the most challenging book for us. And I think the reason for that is that when we read through the 5 chapters of James, we get challenged on things that are very, very relatable to us, things that we can all relate to in the way that we go about our lives today. Even before we reach this point in chapter 4, we've already been challenged on a number of things that I'm pretty sure almost every single one of us will be able to relate to in the preceding 3 chapters. In chapter 1, we're challenged, amongst other things, about our pride, about humility, about the dangers of pursuing wealth and chasing after money. In chapter 2, we're challenged about how we discriminate people, how subconsciously sometimes we can actually discriminate against people without even realizing it. In James 3, amongst other things, we read about how wrong it is that from the same mouth our tongue can both give praise to God and also curse our fellow man, and how wrong that is. I can't read any of those verses without feeling a little bit uncomfortable, because I know in my heart that I am guilty of every single one of those at times. So it's a really challenging book because it's stuff that we can't run away from, in my opinion. But actually, because of the fact that it's very, very relatable stuff that we read about in James, and the fact we're challenged on things that we would look at and go, yeah, you know what, I probably am guilty of that, there is actually a bit of a danger that we can approach it with the wrong attitude. And we could actually slightly brush off what James is trying to say to us. We could approach it with this idea of, I do those things, but so does everybody. We all do these things. And is it really that bad, in the grand scheme of things, to be doing some of this stuff? Are there bigger issues that we should be looking at? But actually what James is trying to do here, and actually through the whole book of James, is he's trying to stir up a change in mindset in the early church. He's trying to challenge the early church in terms of what they consider the status quo to be when it comes to their behaviors. He's trying to challenge them as to where they set the bar for themselves, how high they set a bar for themselves. And he's trying to get them to raise that bar as they pursue righteousness, which is a very churchy word for pursuing a Jesus-esque life, if you like. But actually, if we approach it with that wrong mindset, we can miss a lot of what James is trying to say to us here. So my prayer for us this morning is that we would really soften our hearts and we'd open our minds to what God is actually speaking into our lives this morning and what He's challenging with us with. Paul writes in Romans in chapter 12, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And as we study this passage this morning, I really pray that we would all look to renew our minds. I pray that we would ask God to renew our minds so that we might hear really clearly what it is He's speaking to us today. And I just want to pray into that before we get going. So Lord, I just pray this morning that you would come by your Spirit, Father, and you would renew our minds. God, you would soften our hearts this morning so that we might hear really clearly from you. And Father, I pray that we would be real with ourselves this morning. Lord, when we hear your word, we'll be real with ourselves in terms of where we're at and what it is you're saying to us that we need to change in our lives to become that bit more like you today. In Jesus' name, amen. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. it's pretty likely when James is speaking here that actually he's speaking to the more wealthy members of the early church. He doesn't go so far as to call them rich, but from the fact that they've got enough possessions to be able to engage in foreign trade tells us that he's probably speaking to the slightly wealthier members of the early church. And at first glance, Marcus kind of hinted at this last week, James can come across as a bit harsh at first glance when we don't look at it in the real context. And actually, you could look at this and think that he's maybe having a pop at these guys for just putting into place a plan as to how they're going to earn a living in the next few months. How they're going to go about their jobs, essentially, which at face value seems a little bit harsh. If I was to come up to one of you teachers, and I use this example because about 90% of our congregation here are teachers, Lord help the next generation. But if I was to come up to one of you and I was to say, you teachers, tomorrow you say, I will teach my children algebra, or I will have them study Shakespeare. What's the point? You don't even know what tomorrow's going to bring. You don't know if you've got a tomorrow. What is your life? That might seem a little bit harsh, potentially. And you could probably forgive the guys here for feeling at face value like James is being a little bit harsh here. But again, it's this mindset that he's trying to change. This whole ideology of just doing what everybody else does is what James is trying to break here in these guys. James's point here is that actually it's a dangerous thing for us to fall into behaviors that the world would portray and just to fall into a routine of doing things the same way that everybody else does them. And his point here is that actually as people who know God and as people who are aiming to live a life that is what God would want for us and is in line with his word, then actually our eyes should be open to a different way. And that should change our perceptions. It should change the way we behave on a daily basis. It should change the way we go about our lives, and it should change the way we plan our futures as well. And I felt this friction in my field of work a lot. This friction between doing what everybody else does and doing what I know God would want me to do in a specific situation. And for those of you that don't know what I do for work, I work for a headhunting firm, which is nowhere near as violent as it sounds. You'll be pleased to know. But essentially, we search for executives to work for technology companies. So I approach people and I talk to them about different opportunities and I try and convince them that this might be the best career step for them at this stage. And throughout my career to date, I've seen people operate in a way that frankly made my skin crawl. When you've got this one person that is perfect for a search that you're conducting and you've tried every single standard route to get hold of that person and you can't do it, there are some lengths that people will go to get hold of that person that I never felt comfortable doing. And I can't even count the amount of times that I've seen people lie down the phone to receptionists or PAs, pretending to be members of that person's family, pretending to be doctors of that person, pretending to be in completely different fields of work, just in order to get hold of that person. And you know what? Sometimes in previous companies I worked for, the people that did those things were the most successful consultants in that business. The ones that would go that little bit further to get the job done. And my previous company I worked for was a little bit Wolf of Wall Street in nature, which is why I left the business in the end. We had bells going off in the corner and things like that when deals were getting done. But we also had a leaderboard in the corner of the office, which had every single consultant in that business ranked by your performance year to date. And I actually had to come to a point where, being slightly competitive, as some of you may know, I had to come to a point where I said, am I kind of prepared to see my name at the bottom of that leaderboard in order to go about my job in a way that I feel is ethical and a way that I feel God would want me to do it? And that was seriously tough. But actually, we're called to be different. And we need to dare to be different in the way that we live our lives. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You see, what has annoyed James here with these guys is not the fact that they're tradesmen. And what has annoyed James here is not the fact that these guys maybe even are the wealthier members of the early church. But actually what has annoyed him is the fact that they know who God is. They know who controls the future. They know how uncertain the future is. And yet they're going about their business in exactly the same way as any other businessman would be. He actually goes on later in verse 16 of this chapter to say, you boast in your arrogant schemes. And let me make this very, very clear. To build your life without consulting God is arrogance of the highest degree. To go through any area of your life, regardless of how small or seemingly trivial it might be, to build plans for your life without communicating with the living God or seeking his guidance is arrogant, because it suggests that we are somehow better placed to make these decisions ourselves than we are to seek God. Jesus actually addresses this mindset in Luke 12 and verses 16 to 21. He tells a parable. And he says this: "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I will build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God.'" And my point today, the point of my sermon, is not about money. I've done one money talk this year, and I'm in no rush to do another one anytime soon. But actually, it's this mindset that we've got to understand this morning. And actually, money, or in this case, grain, can be a metaphor for any area in your life that you are building plans in without consulting prayerfully what God would have you do in that situation. Jesus says there, "This very night your life will be demanded of you." James says in this passage we're looking at today, your life is but a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And it's really important that we, as Christians, understand how fragile and how uncertain life is on this earth, how unguaranteed our earthly lives are. When we read in Job, we read that a person's days are determined, and God has decreed the number of his months. And there's almost this mindset in modern society today that we're invincible. That we can go around and we can behave however we want, and we can do the things that we want to do whenever we want to do them, and actually the only person that we have to answer to is ourselves. It's really important that we understand the very temporary nature of this earth that we live in this morning. Even if we're fortunate enough to live for 100 years, which most of us won't be, in the grand scheme of eternity, that's not a lot. And actually, we don't even decree the number of our days, God does. So we may have significantly less than that, and most of us will have less than that. Jesus himself only had somewhere between 30 and 32 years on this earth. And today, if somebody died at that sort of age, we would think it a tragedy. We would think it a completely unexpected tragedy. But that's the amount of time that the Saviour of the world had to fulfill the mission that God had for him on this earth. 30 to 32 years. And the only reason that Jesus managed to fulfill that mission was because he fundamentally lived his life differently to everybody around him. And it's so important that we recognize the need for us to live differently, but it's even more important that we actually then dare to do it. And that's the really hard bit. So what does living differently actually look like today in this society? Well, modern society would tell us that there's a formula to living, a happy and successful life. And there are things that we should prioritize at each stage of our lives, really. Right from school, trying really hard in school, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, by the way, but trying really hard in school so that we can go to the best universities, because only by going to the best universities can we then get the best jobs. And the world would tell you that when you come out of university, the really important thing is for those first 10 years of your career is to really drive your career forwards as hard and as fast as you can, and to maximize your earnings as much as you physically can, so that then when you're sort of 30 to 35 years old and you're starting to settle down, you're married, you want to get on the property ladder, you're in a position to do so. And then when you want to start thinking about having children, which, by the way, you should definitely be doing before the lady in the relationship is 35-ish, biologically, that's when you should be thinking to do that. That's really important. And that means that, therefore, you need to have met your partner several years before that. So I'm rapidly running out of time, if that's the case. But that should be your priority at that stage. And then once you've had your kids, again, you need to earn money. You need to earn money so that you can support your kids through school, through universities, get them up and going in life. And at that point, when you've got maybe 10 years left of your working life, you again need to maximize your earnings as much as possible so that you can retire comfortably off to the south of France or whatever you want to do. And also, in between all of that stuff, you need to find time to find yourself, whatever that means. You need to be able to experience different cultures. You need to learn new languages. You need to meet new people. You need to do all these things that the world tells us we've got to do. And you know what? If we're not really, really careful, we as Christians can get to the point where we're at retirement age, and at no point in our lives have we ever prioritized God as number one. Where we've always had something else that the world is telling us should be priority number one. And it staggers me, the amount of times I see Christians doing this. I see them measuring their lives versus what they see around them. They measure the value of their lives based on what other people around them have got and are doing, rather than actually on how awesome their relationship with the living God is. And I wonder, have we come to a place where actually we're so obsessed with fulfilling what the world says our life should be, that we've actually completely forgotten that we're told very clearly in Proverbs that if we would just submit in all of our ways to God, that he would make our path straight. In Matthew 6 we read, "So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness," that churchy word again, "for a life like Jesus. And all of these things will be given to you as well." If you're really honest with yourself this morning, what is it that you're seeking first today? Are you chasing after what this world would define as the perfect life? Or are you fundamentally daring to live your life differently today? In one of my sermons earlier on this year, I talked about the fact that I'd been to Canada for a few months at the start of 2015, and I'd basically trained to be a ski instructor for a couple of months. And at the end of my time there, I was approached by one of the most senior instructors on the mountain, and I was offered a guaranteed job for this season coming up, teaching skiing in Canada for 3 months on what was a seriously competitive mountain. This was a mountain where there were only about 100 instructors on the whole mountain. 200 guys like myself had just done this course and had become level 2 qualified ski instructors. So already, there's a mismatch there as to how many people are actually going to get jobs there next year. And on top of that, actually to be a Brit and to teach in Canada is seriously difficult. The visas go like crazy. When they released the first round of visas, 2,500 visas went in 2 minutes and crashed the portal online. So actually, for me to be offered a job by this guy, the top instructors basically got to choose 3 people from that course who they wanted to give guaranteed jobs to the following year. And I was incredibly fortunate to have been chosen as one of these 3 guys. But it left me with probably one of the hardest decisions of my life, because actually that had never been part of my plan, to go and do another 6 months in Canada. I'd felt like my plan was to come back here and to crack on. And so this left me with a really, really tough decision. And I came home, I prayed about it a lot, I thought about it a lot. And actually, it was such a tough decision because I was battling with what I felt God was calling me to do at the time, and probably something that I'd only ever imagined would be a pipe dream, to be able to go and do something, probably one of the few things I most enjoy doing in this world, and actually be paid to do it in a place where the snow is probably as good as you can get anywhere in the world. So I was left with this incredibly tough decision, but after a lot of prayer and a lot of serious consideration, I knew that it wasn't what God was calling me to do at the moment. So I turned down the job, and I told a few of my friends about this who were pretty keen skiers themselves, and they could not understand why I'd made this decision. They were like, "You're absolutely mental. Now, you've just been given the opportunity to go and do one of the things that you literally love doing in this world, and to be paid to do it. And instead you're saying that you're going to stay here, and a big part of that is because of church." They said, "Mate, church is still going to be here in 6 months. God's still going to be here in 6 months. What are you doing? Like, you could be living the dream." And these were all things that I'd battled with in my head over this period. But I had to fundamentally come to a place in the end where I said, "You know what, God, I'm going to do what I think you're telling me to do. And I'm going to trust you with the rest of it. I'm going to trust that you know that I need a little bit of excitement and fun in my life. But I'm going to trust you with that, and I'm going to make the decision that I think you're calling me to do." But it was such a hard decision, probably a harder decision than it should have been, really, in my mind. It's really, really tough to live like that. But it's tough fundamentally to actually live a life that's really, really categorically different to everybody around you. That's not an easy thing to do. Katie brought us a challenge a few weeks back saying, if the Holy Spirit left your life, would it actually look any different? Would your life look any different without the Holy Spirit not in it? And in a similar vein, I would ask you this morning, if somebody was just to watch you in your natural environment outside of this church, if somebody was to watch you in your office or in your university or in your school, wherever you are, and was just to watch and listen, do you think they would be able to tell straight away who the Christian in that group of people is? Because this is a massive challenge for me in my workplace, and definitely an area that I fail in. Because it's really, really difficult to not behave how people around you behave. You know, when that big deal falls through, it's really hard not to react the way that everybody else reacts in the office. You know, when that client is making your life hell, it's really hard not to call that person something derogatory like everyone else does. At the Christmas parties, when everyone else is drinking too much, it's really hard not to do that yourself. And trust me, these are all areas that over the years I've failed in. But actually it's really, really dangerous when we start to make allowances for ourselves based on what everyone else around us is doing as Christians. And again, the world, modern society would say to you, give yourself a break. You know, you're only human. Am I wrong, or is that phrase, you're only human, has that become an excuse that we can use to just brush off sin that's present in our lives? Now give yourself a break, mate. Everybody drinks too much sometimes. Everybody swears sometimes. Everybody gossips. Everybody has sexual thoughts about someone that isn't their husband or their wife. Everybody does that. And I'm not saying that these things don't happen. I'm not saying that they don't even happen to the most committed of Christians. And I'm definitely not saying that we can expect to be perfect. But just like James, I want to challenge our mindset on it this morning. Where do we set that bar in our lives? Where do we set that bar in terms of what's actually acceptable and what's passable in our lives when it comes to sin? Katie also challenged us a few weeks back about this Jekyll and Hyde situation. You know, this battle that goes on between our flesh and our spirit. Do we use grace as a get-out-of-jail-free card sometimes? Do we use grace as an excuse to let that flesh side of our being take control and do whatever it wants in certain situations? Do I use my fallen and broken nature as a reason to allow sin to exist in my life unchallenged? I want to play you a 5-minute audio clip, which is an extract of a sermon by a guy called John Piper, who'll be familiar to many of you. But for those of you that don't know him, he's a Baptist minister in Minneapolis. He's quite a famous Christian author as well. And this is an extract from a sermon that he titled Make War, which is based on Romans 8 verse 13. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live.
The only possible attitude toward out-of-control desire is a declaration of all-out war. I hear so many Christians murmuring about their imperfections and their failures and their addictions and their shortcomings, and I see so little war. Murmur, murmur, murmur. Why am I this way? Make war! If you wonder how to make war, go to the manual. Don't just bellyache about your failures. Make war. He says, I'm continuing the quote, there is something about war that sharpens the senses. You hear a twig snap or rustling of the leaves and you are in attack mode. Someone coughs and you are ready to pull the trigger. Even after days of little or no sleep, war keeps us vigilant. There is a mean, violent streak to the true Christian life. But now let's very carefully ask, violence against whom? Or what? Not other people. Not other people. Not other people. Not Muslims. Not Hindus. Not Buddhists. Not atheists. Not secularists. Not nominal Christians. Not wives or husband or children or ornery bosses. But on every impulse in our soul to be violent to other people. Violence, a mean streak in Christianity against our own selves and all in us that would make peace with sin and a settling in peacetime mindset. We make war on that in us. It's a violence against all lust in ourselves, all enslaving desires for food, caffeine, sugar, chocolate, alcohol, pornography, money, the praise of man, approval of others, power, fame. This is our enemy. This is where we make war. It is a violence against all racism in our souls, all sluggish indifference to injustice in our souls, a violence against all indifference to poverty and indifference to abortion in our souls. Did you know that in the warfare of Romans, Satan doesn't show up until chapter 16? We tend to think of spiritual warfare as this little thing where you find some way to pray or some way to lay hands on or some way to do a Satan thing. Well, that's important. Believe me, that's important. We war not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and world rulers of this present darkness and spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. That's important. But you know what? It's not nearly as important as this. Because the only foothold Satan has in your life is your flesh and your sin. Nobody goes to hell because of Satan. The only reason we go to hell is sin. Much more important than fighting Satan is fighting sin.
So daring to be different means that we need to actually be prepared to declare outright war on every single aspect of our lives that isn't different. Every single aspect of our lives that's determined by the flesh rather than the spirit. Every single aspect of our lives that follows the pattern of this world, we need to be prepared to declare war on. You know, in Matthew 5, we're called to be a light in this world. We're called to be a city on a hill. And what I'm about to say sounds pretty obvious, but bear with me. The only reason that light stands out against the darkness is because it's fundamentally so different to it. You know, the reason that light in any situation can act as a guide or as a comfort to somebody is because it's so completely polar opposite to the darkness. You know, John Piper there describes this whole philosophy as a violent streak to the Christian life. And to be as clear as he was, we're not talking about a violence against anybody else, but we're talking about an absolute, deliberate ruthlessness towards the sin that is in our lives. In John 8, we read about how Jesus saves a woman who's been caught committing adultery, and he saves her from a stoning that she rightfully deserves, according to the law. And I'm not going to read it all in the interest of time, but I'm just going to pick it up at the point where he challenges all of those stood around her, that the first one without sin can throw the first stone. At this, those that heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin," or "sin no more" in some other translations. And it's a lovely story, isn't it? It's a really lovely story of Jesus' grace shown towards a sinner like you and me. But I think what we like to do as Christians with that story is we love to focus on everything apart from that last line. It's a great story because it explains how even though we're all completely broken and flawed and we mess up all of the time, that Jesus still loves us. Jesus still cares for us. He still wants relationship with us. It's a great example of how Jesus came to give life and not to condemn. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to distract from that at all. I'm not trying to kind of do down that story in any way, shape, or form, because I still can't get my head around that amazing mystery that even while we were still sinners, Jesus would die for us. But actually, as I mentioned earlier, let us not use grace as an excuse to allow sin to remain in our lives. Jesus said that final line to the woman for a reason. I've noticed that when Jesus speaks, he normally speaks for a reason, from what I read in the Bible. Go and sin no more, he says to her. And I don't think we like to focus on that bit too much, because that sounds really hard, doesn't it? It actually sounds impossible. Lord, how can I go and sin no more? I am a sinner. How am I supposed to go and sin no more? But Jesus wasn't stupid, and he would have known full well that this woman could not walk away from there and never ever sin in any way, shape, or form again. He was the only human that managed to live like that. And he knows that she wasn't him. But I believe Jesus is speaking very, very specifically here to the sin of adultery in her life. It's almost as though he's saying to her, that thing in your life that always gets you, that one area of weakness in your life, that Achilles heel in your life, that one area of temptation that you really, really struggle with, that one thing that makes you just blend into the background of this world, that one thing that makes you behave the same way that everyone around you behaves, go and stop doing that thing. Sin is such a vast thing. If I was trying to evaluate all of the sin in my life, I would get completely overwhelmed. And there's this battle going on that we've talked about, this battle between the spirit and the flesh. And this is a battle that will go on every single day for the rest of our lives. It's a relentless battle that we're called to. And it's one that in many ways we kind of need to just chip away at day by day. Just chipping away at that sin in our lives so that day by day we can become more like Jesus. But having said that, I'm pretty sure that every single one of us sat here this morning would be able to identify that one area in our life that really gets us. That one thing that we're weak towards. That one thing that, as John Piper says there, we constantly grumble about. Whether to ourselves, whether to God, whether to our friends. That one thing in our lives this morning. And today is the day to make war against that thing. Today is the day to get ruthless against that thing, if we want to dare to be different in this world. So what does it mean to make war against those things? Well, John Piper speaks there about the heightening of the senses. He speaks about how in a war zone, a soldier will find that their senses are heightened to such a degree that the slightest thing makes them ready to react. He says the snapping of a twig causes an alarm. The rustling of leaves puts you into attack mode. And what it means for us is that it means we're ready to react at the first sign of trouble in our life when it comes to that specific thing, that specific sin in our lives. It means as soon as we see a warning sign, we're ready to react. And let's be specific about it. It means if you have a problem with spending money that you don't have, then you get someone else to manage your finances for you. It means that if you can't go out and have a couple of beers without wanting to get really drunk, then you stop drinking alcohol. It means if you have a problem watching pornography on your iPhone or your computer, then you get rid of your iPhone or your computer. It means if your PlayStation or your TV distract you from spending time with God, you get rid of those things from your life. It means if your girlfriend or boyfriend holds you back from pursuing God to the maximum of your potential, then you dump them. It means if that person at work makes you think about sinning sexually, then you get another job. It's deliberate, it's decisive, it's proactive, it's war. It's that Jekyll and Hyde thing again. We cannot afford to let that flesh side of us get a foothold in our lives. Noel and I went to a conference a few weeks ago, and there was a guy called Jay Fallon speaking, who some of you will know. He's an ex-drug addict that came through the Teen Challenge program, found Jesus, transformed his life, and now spends his life evangelizing to drug addicts. And he said to us, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, he said there's two Jay Fallons that constantly he's battling with in his life. There is the Jay Fallon of the spirit, and there is a Jay Fallon of the flesh. And he said, I can't afford to let that other Jay Fallon out. I can't afford to let the world see that other Jay Fallon. At the first sign of trouble, we need to be ready to act. We cannot let that flesh side of us get a foothold in our lives. You know, James is fired up with these wealthy members of the congregation in the early church for the same reason we should be getting fired up with ourselves this morning. Because if we aren't very, very careful, we can just blur into the background of this world. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You know, church, this earthly life is short. We can't actually afford to waste time behaving the way the rest of the world behaves. We can't afford to waste time just acting the same way that everyone else around us acts, because we've got a mission to complete. Remember Beth a few weeks ago? We've got an ark to build. And in order to do that, we need to dare to live our lives differently day by day. So this morning, if you are a prisoner to a specific type of sin that has held you for a long time, and maybe you've tried to shake it many times and you just can't, then I want you to respond this morning. And in the same way, if you know deep in your heart, when you're really honest with yourself, that you are spending more time right now pursuing things of this world and pursuing what this world would say will make you happy and will make you successful than you are of pursuing God, then I want you to respond this morning. And if you don't even know Jesus yet, maybe you've been sat here for weeks or for months, and maybe you've got that mindset that the merchants have got here. You know, in my time I'll do this. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. When it suits me, I'll commit my life to God. You are but a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. We don't know what tomorrow brings. None of us have tomorrow guaranteed. So if that's you, then I want you to respond this morning as well. And maybe it's a response you just need to make in your heart. Maybe it's by speaking to somebody that you know and trust, you respond to this thing. Or maybe it's by having somebody pray with you this morning. And from my experience, when it comes to sin, speaking to somebody else helps. Being accountable to somebody else about that thing is incredibly helpful. So I'm going to hand back to Katie. I'm going to let her decide how we do that. But this morning, if that is you, do not go away from this place unchanged. You know, the whole title of our series is Dare. Dare to do something different. Dare to step out. Dare to make war on that thing this morning.